So this week we'll be concluding the section on methodologies in the study of religion, and I just wanted to make it clear in this section, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the course, that religious studies is an interdisciplinary field, and so people can come from a wide variety of academic backgrounds. Also, they often combine many of these approaches, and I certainly do in my work. So we're going to be working through today some of the other approaches to the study of religion. The study of anthropology is one that is often closely related to the study of religion. So typically in anthropology, we talk about the four fields: archaeology, biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, and linguistic anthropology. But when we're focusing on religion, the two that we probably talk about the most would be archaeology and cultural anthropology. And certainly the program at Nipissing is much more focused on cultural anthropology, although I've had a number of students tell me that they've been on digs in the area. So archaeology is also part of it. And with archaeology, you are looking more at material culture, so various artifacts of religion, which are also very important. But for my research, I tend to focus on cultural anthropology, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Edward Burnett Tylor is considered to be one of the foundational figures in the study of anthropology. He is a problematic figure due to some of the concepts that he developed, and we can talk about that a little bit. But nonetheless, he sort of sketched the outlines of the field, developed the idea of field research and being immersed in culture and so on. So he remains important, but we need to problematize. And anthropology has actually been a Western field of study that has questioned itself a great deal and has reformed itself in light of decolonization, attitudes towards Indigenous people, and so on. So it's still in that process, but it is certainly, I would say, almost more than any of the academic disciplines, it's been self-critical. One of the aspects of Tylor's work that dates him is his idea that of the evolution of culture. And so this was very much tied to Darwinian ideas applied to culture, which certainly I've rejected, and I think many people have rejected, but this idea that somehow culture is evolving, this was part of a larger progress narrative that was very much tied to the kind of colonialism and the idea that somehow Western culture was the superior and so on. So for many of us, we've jettisoned that idea that there's any evolution, but instead that all cultures are equal and they all have idiosyncratic aspects to them, and we need to just look at that. However, an important part of his work was the idea of defining culture, and so this remains very important, and I think it stands the test of time. As you can see in the title of our department, Religions and Cultures, this is an important part of the way we teach religion. That complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. So you can see here, and this is certainly how I would define also religion, that it's part of this larger complex of culture. It doesn't stand alone outside of culture. In Tylor's most famous work, titled Primitive Culture, which he published in 1871, we can see this issue with Tylor right in the title of the book, Primitive Culture. So this is language that wouldn't be used anymore. However, in this work, he developed the idea of animism, which I think, in the interest of not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, is still a really useful idea. So in trying to get at how religion evolved, he talked about the idea that cultures developed a concept of an aspect of the self that was immortal. So what we would call in English the soul. And so he found that in many what we would now call indigenous cultures, the idea of soul was also applied to the environment and to animals and so on. And so he saw this as something that would be, we would evolve out of it towards science. But interestingly, there's a whole movement now called the New Animism, where a number of different thinkers are saying this is actually a very healthy approach and may hold the seeds to helping us resolve the terrible climate crisis that we're in. that perhaps we need to move back to this idea of seeing nature and animals and non-human beings as sacred and partaking of soul. Another important early figure in anthropology is James George Frazer, who wrote the very important work, The Golden Bough, which was published in 1890. And one of the reasons that he remains important is that he developed, he was part of a movement that was interested in the myths of various cultures, and increasingly there was a field of folklore and fairy tale and so on. And so his book, as far as I know, has been in print since it was written because it develops this field of mythology. In this photograph, we see Mary Douglas, the anthropologist who did her fieldwork in Africa, and she remains a very important figure. And I think it's important to note that the field of anthropology has always been hospitable to women, and so we find a lot of women anthropologists. So Douglas is one of them, and her work has been used extensively in religious studies, particularly her work, Purity and Danger. So she looked at the idea of purity as seen in Hindu culture and Jewish culture and so on, and applying it to food rules and how they create religious community. Bringing us into the contemporary period, I just wanted to have a quick look at the work of Dr. Amira Mittermeier, who teaches at the University of Toronto. So Mittermeier did her fieldwork in Egypt and then wrote the book Dreams That Matter, Egyptian Landscapes of the Imagination, which is a fascinating book. So in this, she looks at the Muslim tradition of dreams and prophecy, and the way that that remains vital into the modern day. I want to move us now into looking at the field of the psychology of religion, and here we have a photograph of psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. So Freud, along with Nietzsche, who we've already talked about, is one of the most influential figures in terms of his analysis of religion, and so it was pretty much wholly negative. And so we still hear these arguments today where people will say things like, basically the implication that anyone who's religious has some kind of a mental disturbance. And so for Freud, moving fully into adulthood meant relinquishing any beliefs in religion. Here we have Freud's office. So this would be the setup when he was doing psychoanalysis. And this remains, I would argue, largely the template still for many psychologists, where the basic idea is that the analyst sits with the person, either lying down or sitting. And in this case, Freud talked about delving into the unconscious mind of the person he was talking to. And so in order to do that, he centered on the practice of dream analysis. He called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. And so interestingly, Freud was open to using dreams, but in a very specific way that we will see that Jung develops further. So we have here a picture of the Vienna Circle of Analysts. Vienna in Austria was the sort of ground zero for psychoanalysis prior to World War II. So we have Jung on the far right, and many of Freud's acolytes, such as Adler, went on to create their own schools of psychoanalysis, including Wilhelm Reich also. So there's many great stories about this circle if you're interested in this topic. I wish a movie was made about it. Cronenberg made a movie, but I'd like to see something a little more lighthearted, because Freud had this, he was almost like a prophet figure, and so he gave all of his figures rings, and he saw himself as sort of ushering in this new era. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics in this group. So as I just mentioned, Carl Jung was one of Freud's leading disciples, if we can use that word, and was seen very much as his heir apparent, but they had a falling out over the topic of religion. So Jung, who was the son of a minister, just like Nietzsche, interestingly, was not as dismissive of religion as Freud. And so he was much more open to the idea of religion as a positive force. And he also was very interested, particularly in traditions like Hinduism. He was also interested in indigenous traditions in Africa and in North America. And so Jung used dreams also, but in a very different way. So Jung's form of analysis is much closer to the idea of kind of spiritual practice. And he's actually, this is one of the reasons he's controversial among a lot of psychologists who feel he's much more like a mystic than he is like a psychologist. I don't see why those two things are mutually exclusive, but it is for some people. So Jung becomes a very important figure, and many of his followers have developed ideas about mythology and ritual and so on. Another important figure when we're talking about the study of religion is Rudolf Otto, who comes out of the Protestant tradition. And he developed the idea that there are aspects of religious belief and practice that are particular to religion. And he tried to separate them out and look at them. Probably the most famous concept developed by Otto was the idea of the holy. And this remains very important for many people in religious studies. So he discussed the idea that there is an aspect of religion that is mysterious. He called it the mysterium tremendum, so using Latin, the liturgical language of Christianity, and the idea that this is at the center of religion, and so you can't understand it without understanding that religion is about this feeling that moves us out of the material world and into a sort of transcendent realm. Well, where to begin with Emile Durkheim? His work is so influential. Durkheim was the son of a rabbi who was born in France and was extremely concerned about the decline of religion within French society and what the implications of that were. He also attempted, as we've already seen, to define religion in a way that took in what we would now call sociological aspects of religion. And here we have the definition that he developed in his important work, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, where he called religion a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. So I find this definition to be really useful, as I spoke about before. Durkheim also developed the idea of the sacred and the profane, that like Otto, he believed that religion had this separate aspect of the belief in the sacred, which made it definitively religious, and so would reject that idea of something like your car being the basis of your belief system. It had to be something that was sacred. Although some would argue that for some people their cars are sacred. I think you could actually argue that. Also, Durkheim developed the idea of anomie, which we'll be looking at a little further on in the course, which was the idea of what happens to people when they lose that sense of meaning and purpose that was traditionally given by religion, and how dangerous that can be for society and for the individual. And now we're coming towards the end of this slideshow with the figure of Max Weber, the German foundational figure in sociology, who's also very important in terms of the study of religion. One of Weber's most important concepts is his idea of the iron cage. This is an idea beloved by graduate students all over North America anyway. So Weber was very concerned, as was Durkheim, with what was happening in culture in Europe at the time with the loss of religion for many people. So he believed that society was becoming much more technocratic and bureaucratic, and certainly we can see now in our time he was extremely prophetic in saying this. So he writes, now bound to the technical and economic conditions of machine production, each person is only a single cog in an ever-moving mechanism. So he's critiquing here that mechanical model that was increasingly coming to the fore in Western society. And he believed that with the decreasing strength of religion, we were going to see this kind of problem more and more, that human beings would be reduced to just cogs in a machine. Probably Weber's most famous work is called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And he talks about the influence of those psychological sanctions which, originating in religious belief, gave a direction to practical conduct. So what Weber does is connect religious belief to social change. Now, this is a controversial topic still. I find it convincing. You need only look at the difference between, I always use the example of Toronto and Montreal and the difference in culture. So my argument would be you could completely apply the Protestant work ethic to Ontario. So I had a colleague from Quebec ask me one time, why do people in Ontario always ask you what you do? And I sort of stared at him blankly because that's what we ask. But apparently in Quebec, that's not what you ask people. So that emphasis on work, Weber would argue, comes from the Protestant tradition. So you don't even have to be a Protestant, but it's influenced culture. So you can see instantly when you go to Montreal, for instance, that there's much less emphasis on work. And so it partakes of a much more Catholic type of cultural approach to work. So you may or may not agree with this, but this work is still influential, and it's used in political science, and it's used in sociology, along with religious studies. So as I've been trying to illustrate throughout this presentation, these ideas remain influential certainly in religious studies and beyond. And so I wanted to end with Lisa Miller, whose work we've looked at in terms of the Brian Bethune article. And so she's a psychologist, American, who works in the field of religion and psychology. And so she's part of a kind of new generation who's much more open to looking at the positive aspects of religion, as we saw in the idea of how it relates to adolescent psychology. So we're seeing this more and more now, that people in the field of psychology are more open to looking at how religion can be used as a resource for mental health rather than looking at it as a completely negative phenomenon.